Modern technocracy and transhumanism represent the belief that science and technology will fulfill the utopia of a perfect society. This is the utopian belief system of the elite. Technocracy is the economic and social domination of society and people through a new economic and socio-political order, so that politics and democracy are not needed at all. The history of technocracy dates back to the United States in the early 20th century, when academics and scientists were considering various scientific and technological innovations and their impact on society and economy and administrative structures. Technocracy is a utopian economic system that rejects a price-based economy in favor of an energy or resource-based economy. Technocracy changes the way we think about economics, governance, religion, and law. It rules by regulation, not by the rule of law. Policy is made by unelected and unaccountable technocrats. In the early 20th century, the idea of technocracy was further developed and kept alive by people such as Frederick Taylor, an American mechanical engineer best known for his book, The Principles of Scientific Management, and Walter Rothenstrach, a professor at Columbia University. At that time, a group of intellectuals adopted a technocratic mindset, and around the same time the group broke away from Columbia University. The so-called New School was formed, led by two men, Thorstein Veblen and his young protege Howard Scott. In 1921, Veblen published his magnum opus, a book entitled Engineers and the Price System. It was not until the 1929 U.S. stock market crash and the Great Depression that the technocrats had their chance. Society was ripe for technocracy during the Great Depression. Indeed, it seemed that capitalism was dead. Unemployment, deflation, hunger, anger at politicians and capitalists, and other social problems had people begging for an explanation of what went wrong and what could be done to fix it. Technocracy could answer both questions. Capitalism had died a natural death, and a technocratic society would save them. The engineers, scientists, and technicians who would run this technocratic utopia would eliminate all waste and corruption. People would only have to work 20 hours a week and everyone would have a job. Abundance would be everywhere. However, the ideas of the technocrats did not gain much ground during the Great Depression and World War II and remained dormant deep below the surface, waiting for a better opportunity to emerge and play a greater role in society. Until they resurfaced in 1968 when Columbia University professor Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote the book, Between Two Ages, America's Role in the Technotronic Era, in which he states, "The technotronic era will be accompanied by the gradual emergence of a more controlled and managed society. Such a society would be ruled by an elite whose political power would be based on superior scientific knowledge. The constraints imposed by traditional liberal values would not prevent this elite from achieving its political goals by using the latest modern technologies to influence the behavior of citizens and keep society under close control and surveillance." Brzezinski was well aware of what technocracy was, because it was developed at Columbia University in the early 1930s. The book, Between Two Ages, America's Role in the Technotronic Era, predicted the kind of technotronic era represented by the UN's Agenda 2030 and the World Economic Forum and its goals, which will be clearly visible at the practical level in the 2020s. Brzezinski's book caught the attention of David Rockefeller, who soon decided to create the Trilateral Commission with Zbigniew Brzezinski. In 1973, Zbigniew Brzezinski and David Rockefeller founded the Trilateral Commission, an elite organization whose nature and aims followed the American belief system of the 1930s, technocracy. The idea of the Trilateral Commission was to create a new international economic order. In the year of its creation, Brzezinski and Rockefeller selected 250 elitists from the United States, Europe, and Japan to join them. Rockefeller and Brzezinski presented the idea of a trilateral commission at the Bilderberg meeting in 1972. Brzezinski became executive director of the Trilateral Commission from 1973 to 1976, before joining the Jimmy Carter administration to work on national security. As early as 1973, Brzezinski spoke of the joint decision-making power of the state and big business. Asked in 1974 what Brzezinski meant by the new international economic order, he replied, "When I talk about the current international system, I am talking about relations in certain areas, above all between the Atlantic countries, trade, military and mutual security relations involving the International Monetary Fund, NATO, and so on. We need to transform the international system into a global system in which new, active, and creative forces that have recently emerged should be integrated. This global system must include Japan, Brazil, the oil-producing countries, and even the Soviet Union, to the extent that the Soviet Union is willing to participate in the global system." When Rockefeller and Brzezinski had set up the Trilateral Commission and started to pursue a new international economic order, they immediately passed the baton to the United Nations, which the Rockefellers had been heavily involved in setting up. In 1974, the United Nations adopted a resolution entitled Declaration on the Establishment of a New International Economic Order, which used the language of the technocrats and was largely based on their ideas.
Illustrating dramatically the undeniable interdependence of the many issues which must be tackled in the evolution of a new world economic order. One where bold and positive action can be taken to establish a new economic and social order which will be the foundation of a new world economic order.
In 1976, when Jimmy Carter was elected president and Zbigniew Brzezinski became his national security advisor, both Carter and his vice president Walter Mondale were members of the Trilateral Commission. Henry Kissinger also played a major role in promoting technocratic ideas. Kissinger was also a member of the Trilateral Commission. The members of the Trilateral Commission had enough connections to the foreign policy elite that they could reasonably expect to get into senior government positions, regardless of whether a Republican or a Democratic administration was in power. Republican President Richard Nixon had Henry Kissinger as his national security advisor, and Democrat Jimmy Carter had Zbigniew Brzezinski as his national security advisor and confidant. After more than 40 years of effort, the technocrats finally reached the center of U.S. power in the 1970s and were able to put their plans into action. Their choice? Not the United States, where they knew they would face predictable opposition. Instead, the technocrats chose China. China looked like North Korea today. There was no market economy, there was starvation, there was no industry, and there was a dictatorial culture. China represented a blank slate on which the Rockefellers and technocrats could start to build a new order. When Zbigniew Brzezinski won over Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping, Brzezinski did not teach China about free markets or capitalism. He taught them technocracy. This is one of the reasons why China's rise has been so dramatic. China has excelled in using, exploiting, expanding, and exporting technocracy to the world. Modern China is the poster child for technocracy. It has perfected the use of surveillance, artificial intelligence, social credit scores to keep its citizens in check and force them to do whatever it wants. And if they don't comply voluntarily, they are forced to do so. Brzezinski was so keen to normalize relations with China that he didn't mind selling Taiwan or hiding his actions from the American public. We are starting from a premise we have already accepted, that there is only one China. Not 1.5 China or 2 China or China and Taiwan. For us, there is only one China. Brzezinski was clearly throwing Taiwan overboard in favor of China. In return, Brzezinski seemed to plead that the Chinese do nothing that would unduly alarm a wary American public. It seems that both sides understood the deal they had struck. It is only in recent years that the general public has begun to understand the extent to which China's technocratic control system has been taken to, and Americans are waking up to the same lesson in their own country. The early members of the Trilateral Commission repeatedly claimed that they were not interested in a political coup, but simply wanted to create a new international economic order. During the Carter administration, he and Walter Mondale were members, Brzezinski was a member, and at one point all but one member of the Carter administration was a member of the Trilateral Commission. However, they had to work slowly because they lacked voter support for many of the technocratic initiatives. We are grateful to the Washington Post, the New York Times, Time magazine, and other great publications whose directors have attended our meetings and respected their promises of discretion for almost 40 years. It would have been impossible for us to develop our plan for the world if we had been subject to the bright lights of publicity during those years. But the work is now much more sophisticated and prepared to march towards a world government. The supranational sovereignty of an intellectual elite and world bankers is surely preferable to the national self-determination practiced in past centuries. The World Economic Forum and the UN's Agenda 2030 aim to complete the new international economic and social order. They do this, among other things, by redefining the starting points on artificial grounds and by creating their own technocratic solutions to these artificially defined starting points. This is precisely the basis of the Great Reset, represented by the World Economic Forum. This is the ideology that they have been promoting for 50 years. The Great Reset is a new international economic and social order that is effectively a reheated technocracy of the 1930s. It is an energy and resource-based system in which an elite group of people and organizations control all resources and ordinary citizens own nothing. By way of comparison, the World Economic Forum is made up of the same type of people as the Trilateral Commission, but with a much broader membership. It includes the media, lawyers, politicians, and CEOs of large companies. While the Trilateral Commission was secretive about its activities, the World Economic Forum is fully open about its plans. They have an extensive website with a huge number of articles that anyone can explore. In the articles, they state exactly what their plans are. It is also important to note that the World Economic Forum is so firmly anchored in the United Nations that it can be difficult to see where the two groups differ. The UN's Agenda 2030 is also full of high-concept, abstract, and totally unrealistic goals, which are made to sound responsible but have nothing to do with practical realism, and which in no way take into account the starting points of the various nation-states and their contribution to the contents mentioned in the agenda. UN Agenda 2030 is not based on voluntary action, but on regulation and legal commitment. Through years of propaganda from hundreds of different sources, citizens are driven into a new economic and social order, New World Order, in which social action and management, as well as citizens' worldview, are based on cultural relativism and dishonestly created premises. If you look at technocratic and New World Order phenomena only in the 21st century, you might think it all started with Klaus Schwab, the World Economic Forum, and the Fourth Industrial Revolution. If, on the other hand, the focus is only on the work of the Trilateral Commission, the focus is on Henry Kissinger, David Rockefeller, Zbigniew Brzezinski in the early 1970s. Such an approach would leave out the essential background, which goes back to the 1930s and Columbia University. Richard Gardner, a member of the Trilateral Commission and professor, wrote an article in Foreign Affairs in 1974 entitled "The Hard Road to World Order." He said, "It will look like a great booming, buzzing confusion, but an Indran, around national sovereignty, eroding it piece by piece, will accomplish much more than the old-fashioned frontal assault." With the creation of the Trilateral Commission in 1973, the strategy evolved from the old-fashioned frontal attack to a more intelligent and multifaceted one. After Richard Gardner argued that circumventing national sovereignty was necessary because direct aggression would not work, national sovereignty has been eroded and hacked away piece by piece for the last 50 years.
But what we are very proud of now is the young generation, like Prime Minister Trudeau, President of Argentina and so on, is that we penetrate the cabinets. So yesterday I was at a reception for Prime Minister Trudeau, and I know that half of this cabinet, or even more, half of this cabinet, are for our actually young global leaders of the world economic forum.
The best example of technocracy in the West is the European Union. The EU has taken over almost every function in the countries it governs. On the other hand, Spain, Germany, and Finland still have national governments. But do they have the same power today as they did, say, 30 years ago? Of course not. Today, the EU takes all major political decisions in Europe on behalf of individual countries, without taking into account the importance of nation-states and their cultural, historical, economic, or geopolitical backgrounds and differences. This has been the standard modus operandi of technocracy, to erode national sovereignty and eventually to abolish the political structure altogether. The underlying idea of technocracy is that society is run in a totalitarian, top-down, resource, and energy-based way by controlling and measuring human impact. Political and democratic power will disappear because society will be run by an elite of scientists and experts. Whereas the traditional economic concept is based on the law of supply and demand and freer markets, the technocratic economic concept is based on an energy and emissions-based model, controlled and determined by the distribution and consumption of energy. Instead of money, the medium of payment would be energy revenue. The price of goods and services is artificially determined by the amount of energy consumed to bring the product or service to market. Technocracy minimizes the use of raw materials, minimizes waste, and determines consumption. The UN Agenda 2030 is pushing for exactly this same model, a redefinition of business, infrastructure, and institutions in a more sustainable direction, where traditional money and its associated value is replaced by an energy and emissions-based unit and credit based on carbon footprint and consumption. The traditional economic and social concept is replaced by a green concept, green transition, green economy, etc. And the ideology is totalitarianly driven from the top down through hundreds of different stakeholders, such as educational institutions, politicians, businesses, NGOs, foundations, and governmental organizations. UN Agenda 21 and Agenda 2030 are a technocratic blueprint for the 21st century, and sustainable development is a tool for implementation. The UN is the administrator, and the underlying influencers and agents are the World Economic Forum, the Trilateral Commission, and the globalist partners. In 1992, at the UN Earth Summit in Rio, 179 countries committed themselves to promoting Agenda 21, a comprehensive action plan to protect the environment and achieve sustainable development worldwide. The term sustainable development originally appears in the 1987 Brundtland Commission report, and Gro Harlem Brundtland is also a member of the Trilateral Commission. And in 2015, at the UN General Assembly in New York, member states committed to the UN's so-called Sustainable Development Agenda, which includes 17 major goals and 169 sub-goals to change the world. And so the United Nations 2030 Agenda was born.